Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. I will be talking about capacity development for women and youth to achieve higher levels of resilience. Let me share my screen with you. I think you can see it now. The talk about training and building capacities of women and youth for climate action and resilience. But first, let me talk about or introduce who we are. So we are the basically the Global Education and Training Institute, which is established in Incheon in South Korea with the support of the Korean government, the national government and the local government in Incheon city. And our primary purpose is providing training. So most of our training is focused on national and local governments, and we help them understand what they need to achieve higher degrees of disaster resilience and climate resilience. The overarching framework is the Sendai framework. Many of you may be aware of it. This was adopted in the third UN World Conference in March 2015. And this is basically a guide to not only national and local governments, but also other stakeholders, including youth groups, women groups, and community-based organizations, NGOs, and so on how to increase resilience to disaster risks and climate risks. Now, one point to be noted here is the Sendai framework considers disaster risk to include climate risk. So it whenever it mentions disaster risk, it covers the climate risk as well. The Sendai framework has 7 global targets, 4 priorities for action, but most importantly, it recognizes the multi-stakeholder role in achieving higher levels of resilience. And it understands that governments cannot do it alone. They need the civil society groups, they need the marginalized groups, including women, including youth, including children. Everyone has a role to play and everyone should participate. So, as I mentioned, Sendai framework specifically mentions that government should engage with children and youth. They have mentioned certain guiding principles under which youth leadership should be promoted for enhancing resilience. And then they also look at the role of stakeholders and consider children and youth as the agents of change, and that they need to be given the space where they can contribute to risk reduction, again, which includes climate risk reduction through legislation, practices, education, and so on. At the same time, the Sendai framework also recognizes the need for gender balance and gender parity, and including all in the decision making, including, of course, women. So the Sendai framework does not stand in isolation. It coordinates well with the Paris Agreement and the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Basically, the Sendai framework understands that climate change, climate risk, and disaster risks are pushing us back, and they are barriers to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So if we are serious about trying to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals or the Agenda 2030, we need to address the climate and the disaster risks. And also, it understands that the capacities, not only of governments, but of stakeholders, needs to be increased so that they can manage the risk better. So there is a call in the Sendai framework for all players, including governments, but also the other stakeholders, to actively pursue capacity development of all stakeholder groups, including women and youth. And this is a kind of a simplified picture of what it looks like. If you see in the center, the risk-informed sustainable development, that is the objective of every group, of every country, of every government, of every society. And the enabling frameworks are the 2030 Agenda, the Paris Agreement, New Urban Agenda, and so on, including the Sendai framework. So what we want to do is, as we try to achieve the central risk-informed sustainable development, we want to reduce mortality, affected people, economic losses and damages. And we want to increase cooperation, early warning, risk assessments, and so on. So you see all these SDGs here, all 17 of them, and you can think about this or reflect. Is there any SDG here which will not be impacted by a disaster or climate change? Think about it, and your answer will be no. All of these SDGs can and will be impacted by climate and disaster risk. We have the recent example of COVID, where again, you can reflect and see that COVID has impacted all of these SDGs. So we understand more now the systemic nature of risk, that impact in one sector can impact other sectors. And that's why it is important to address risk comprehensively and include disaster and climate risk in all our decision making. The SDGs, as you know, has references to disaster risk and climate risk. So the SDG, the Agenda 2030, actually links with the Paris Agreement and the Sendai framework. And these are just some of the examples of the language in the Agenda 2030, including a call for application of technology to address the frequent and intense disasters. Now, I'll go through each of the SDGs very quickly. I don't want to spend time on it, but basically just to give you an idea of how each SDG is linked with the Paris Agreement and the Sendai framework. So here, SDG 1, then we have SDG 11, which is on safe cities. And of course, there is one global initiative called the Making Cities Resilient 2030, which aims to help cities and other stakeholders achieve SDG 11. We have SDG 13, which is on climate change, so directly linked. And then we have hunger, health, and education. Again, as you saw from the COVID experience, how disaster risk can impact all of these SDGs. And there are a lot of tools available to help us achieve the SDGs, especially SDG 3 on health, but also on others like food security, poverty, and so on. So I encourage you to find these tools and use them. Then SDG 5 is on gender, there's clean water, there's focus on building resilient infrastructure. So all of these, again, looking at the role of disaster and climate risk and the impact, the differential impact it has on the youth, on the women, and on girls, as you see. Again, the SDG 14, 15 are aiming to make life more sustainable in the oceans and on the land. And again, looking at how to manage better marine ecosystems, coastal ecosystems, and linking with nature-based solutions and so on. So again, the clear link between sustainable development and Sendai. And here, this is just an example to show how there is a common reporting between the Sendai framework and the Agenda 2030. And some of the indicators are same. So as we go forward, especially with the youth and women, we need to create these capacities, not only to look at all these agendas and frameworks individually, but also to bring them in coherence. That means align them in their outcomes. So we have certain routes for engagement of youth and women. There's a Words into Action guideline on children and youth engagement in Sendai framework. We have specific training material for children and youth. We have training materials on cases on integration of gender concerns during risk reduction activities. There are regional assessment reports turned out by UNDRR in which youth groups are engaged and gender groups are engaged. We, of course, promote the higher education to build DRR literacy, again, targeting specifically the youth. In all the platforms, we organize events or side events for youth and for gender groups. And we also promote a safe space for their voice. And of course, in the UN, there is active participation through ECOSOC Youth Forum, for example, where youth groups find a voice in the UN General Assembly and in all the policies. So there are a number of entry points for building capacity of youth and women for better resilience. And I hope that today's discussions would also bring forth some other new ideas which we can take forward. Thank you for your attention.